the precise argument that somehow having this referendum on EU membership and then implementing the Leave result, whatever that meant, was somehow going to make this question go away. Whatever one thinks about the result, clearly it's failed in that respect. The question of Europe, the question of European Union is there. It's always going to be there. We haven't made it go away.
Hello, I'm Brendan Donnelly. Until recently, I was director of the Federal Trust, but earlier this year, my guest, Andrew Blick, took over as the director of the Federal Trust. Andrew has a very distinguished academic background. We're honoured and delighted to have him as the new director. We're going to be talking today about the sort of things that he wants the Federal Trust to be concentrating on. In his work with the Federal Trust, Andrew has made it very clear that he is sympathetic with and familiar with the ideas and principles of federalism and the Federal Trust. So we're looking forward very much to the next few years. Andrew, once again, welcome. What do you think should be the main focuses of the Federal Trust work over the coming years? And is there a common thread running through these main topics?
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks again for all you've done for the trust. And I know we're hoping to keep you around to carry on doing things for us as well. And really looking forward to helping steer what the trust does in its work over coming years, and having been involved with it continuously for a very long period of time. It's good to be now helping out in this role in the trust. And as to the question of what I think we should be doing, as ever with the trust, all the work we do is interlinked, and I suppose this links up to the concept of federalism, which is partly about what are the different layers of governance at which we can address different problems and different challenges, and thinking about what the trust should be doing over the past few years and what's been going on this year. The three key themes I wanted to identify to get us to think about in what we do are: first, the UK relationship with the European Union. This is an ongoing issue. It's something the trust has been interested in for many years, as long as there's been a European Union and before there was a European Union. In many ways, Federal Trust is associated with the Federalist movement in the UK, which helped actually create the idea of what became the European Union in the late 1930s onwards. So this is a very important area we've been looking at, and it's a very important area for the UK. The second area I think we need to consider, and again it's linked to the first area, is the issue of democracy, because federalism, if it's going to be meaningful, has to be linked with democracy. It's not just about having issues dealt with at different levels of governance. It's about dealing with them democratically and ensuring that decisions are held to account in a democratic way, and the people who represent us are democratically elected and can be democratically removed as well. So democracy is really important, and you go back to any period in history, people are always worried about democracy, and in a way, they're right to always be worried about democracy, because there are always anti-democratic forces out there that deliberately or unwittingly will undermine democracy. But we know that at the moment, there's a lot more concern about the future of democracy, both within the UK and internationally. And therefore, we need to be taking this seriously and looking at that. It's an issue that can't be avoided. And the third area I want to talk about, which is not my area of expertise, but I know enough to know it's going to be a really serious item on the agenda that, like the democracy issue and like the European issue, we can't avoid, whether we like it or not. This issue is coming our way, is already here in many ways, is going to get more serious. And that's the question of the environment. And the reason I picked the issue of the environment, and in particular the climate crisis, is because, like the other two issues I've just mentioned, they're things that have to be dealt with at different levels. They have to be dealt with locally. The impacts of environmental change is local, has to be resolved locally, has to be mitigated locally, and has to be also dealt with at the kind of UK level, the country level of governance, but then also any serious action to prevent climate change, to mitigate the impacts of climate change, whatever's going to be done about it, or unfortunately not done about it, as the case may be, has to be an international effort. And that's why federalism, again, is an important way of thinking about these problems and how we might address them.
Let's go through them one by one, shall we? Future relationship with the European Union. Seems to me that that's proceeding on two parallel, separate, interlinking tracks, perhaps. Tell me what you think. There's the question of the reset with the European Union, which is basically about trade and economic relations. And I'd be interested to have your view on how far that's going. And then there's also the question of the defense of Europe and the way in which the United Kingdom hopes to be able and probably will be able to play a part in the reconfiguration of the defence structure, the security structure for Europe, even while remaining, at least initially, outside the European Union. How do you see these two topics as relating to each other?
The first observation to make there, and I know you know this better than I do, Brendan, is that what this establishes is the fact that we're talking about these two things, and that these two things are at the forefront of the UK political scene shows the precise argument that somehow having this referendum on EU membership and then implementing the Leave result, whatever that meant, was somehow going to make this question go away. Whatever one thinks about the result, clearly it's failed in that respect. The question of Europe, the question of European Union is there. It's always going to be there. We haven't made it go away. That's an obvious observation, which is why we need, this is why this is an issue. It's not going to go away. We need to look at it. To come to your two specific points, the reset. Well, the reset to me makes it sound a bit like your PC's not working and you can just switch it off and switch it on again in the hope that the problem you had with it might go away. It's not going to happen like that. So this reset, whenever I hear any kind of attempt to explain it, seems to be a bit of a variant on the have your cake and eat it kind of argument, school of thought, which we tried to pursue first when we weren't in what was then the EEC when it was set up. We thought by establishing a rival organisation, EFTA, we could somehow use that to get ourselves some kind of cherry picking deal. That didn't work. We ended up joining eventually. Then, when we were inside what became the EU, we were trying various ways of cherry picking from inside, getting special deals. Some would say we did quite well in that respect, if you think that whole strategy is a good idea in the first place. But then that wasn't good enough, and we left. On the way out, we thought we could cherry pick. We found out otherwise. Now we're outside again, and the reset to me often sounds like all those who are trying to advocate it don't often go into that much detail about how it's going to work. But in as far as they do, they make it sound like cherry picking. And I think when you hear arguments like we don't have to choose between the US and the EU, seems to be a bit of a variant on that as well, that we can somehow get a great deal out of both of them and play them both off against each other. All of that I think is ludicrous. I'm surprised it hasn't already been exposed as such yet, but it certainly is. So uh, in as far as there any substance to reset, it seems to be about fairly meager things which might be significant to the people involved. So I don't want to completely dismiss the problems that people are experiencing at all. But if it's on things like work visas for people under a certain age or some kind of veterinary deal, these are all could be significant for sectors of the economy. But all they really serve to do is show that we're having to integrate ourselves as far as we can from the outside, and they're much, much, much inferior versions of what actually being in the EU was, and then certainly not a substitute for EU membership. They're just off taking some of the absolute worst edges off being outside. So that's the reset point. On to the second point of military arrangements and defence sector arrangements. Well, one point there is we're not fully in the whatever agreements are being reached within the EU, it seems like there's all kinds of obstacles to us benefiting from any of the financial deals that may be arising from whatever arrangements the EU arise in. But also, it's a further point that we can make about the nature of the arguments around Brexit that I distinctly remember during the referendum campaign that one of the key arguments being put forward by the Leave campaign was that the European Union posed a major threat because it might start to integrate militarily and we might get a European army of some kind. Now it seems as though people, including some people, I think, who have been favourable to Brexit, or at least accepting of Brexit, seem to be arguing that the EU does need to get some kind of military arrangement, and Europe does need to integrate militarily. So again, that argument's kind of collapsed. So yes, I'm certainly in favour of more defence integration in Europe, but I would also like to note, and we need to note, that it does explode further arguments that were mounted in favour of Brexit in the past. So I also think that if that does happen, it will be a major development in the pattern of European integration. Because back in the 50s, one of the setbacks for European integration in the mid 50s was the attempt to establish a European army, which I think was voted down in the end in the French Parliament. And that's why the idea was defeated. Europe then developed in other ways, economically and politically. But
Mm.
if we're actually coming back to military integration as well, which also to me points in the direction of more integrated foreign policy for Europe as well. That's a major development. I really regret that it's necessary. I think the reason it was seen as necessary in the 1950s to a large extent was because of the threat from the Eastern Bloc. Uh, I regret that we're back in a position where we feel like that again. I think maybe what we haven't got now, which we had a bit more then, is support from the other side of the Atlantic. So in a way, the need, in some senses, although I don't think that the Russia is as big a military threat as the Soviet Union was, the lack of an ally of a solid ally in the US makes the problem larger. So I really regret that it's necessary. But if it's going to happen, this is a serious development and one that also exposes another of the completely misleading arguments put forward during the referendum campaign.
Let's talk about democracy because
Yeah.
there are people who think that exactly what you just mentioned, uh, transatlantic circumstances, the presidency of Donald Trump, is a very good example of the dangers to democracy that you see. Um, what do you have in mind? Is it a more um, global phenomenon that we should be looking at, or is it different in different countries?
It's both global and specific to particular countries. There are always threats to democracy. Movements like populism have always been around. Movements like fascism in various different forms have always been around. Extremism of the left as well. We've already touched on some of those issues historically that Europe has faced. I suppose a particular problem at the moment is that countries which seem to have progressed more in a democratic direction during what we called the third wave of democratization, which ran from the 1970s maybe through to the early 20th century. Some of those countries after having seemed to move towards democracy, I think, for example, of within the EU, and let's not forget this is going on within the EU, we can't be blind to that, is Hungary, for example, is an example of a state which appeared to move more towards democracy, has now moved decisively away from it. That's going on. But also added to that, we're seeing countries that were regarded as stable democracies as countries which could be counted on to remain pretty democratic and also to some extent, although not always perfectly, to promote democracy elsewhere are now apparently moving in an authoritarian direction. Obvious example being the US, but obviously, again, within the EU and in the UK, we see populist movements that have a clearly authoritarian, anti democratic flavour to them becoming powerful, even if they're not always coming to power, or sometimes, as in the case of Poland, they can be removed from power to some extent. They're there and they are forces within, and I suppose Poland's an example of bit like Hungary, one of these countries which moved away from authoritarianism and then has experienced some difficulties. But in the case of, say, France, we see a powerful populist movement at the right. In the UK, we see Reform UK. So the established democracies, as they're once regarded as being, are also in difficulties. That's a bit of a different challenge, and that's in some ways why people are even more worried about democracy. It's actually come because these problems have actually come to what were regarded as the established democracies.
What would you see as being the role of the Federal Trust in contributing to this debate? What are the specific arguments and values that the Trust can bring forward?
I think there were two major warning signals for democracy in the same year in 2016. One of them was Donald Trump getting elected for the first time. When he got in, he proved to be, although not a good president, did lots of unpleasant things. He didn't fully implement all of the aspects of his program, and that may have lulled people into a sense that, well, things can just kind of carry on, and then you get rid of the president and you get a different one in. Second time around, Trump's clearly been a lot worse.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
No one was the nice guy. I mean, people criticize politicians when they don't deliver on what they promise to do, but sometimes it can be a lot worse when they actually do that. And then the other signal we got was the EU referendum. And Donald Trump very clearly said during his campaign that if he gets elected, it will be a kind of Brexit on stilts, I suppose you could say, which is in many ways true. And we see the kind of policies that Trump's pursuing with tariffs, the self-harm is analogous to Brexit in many ways. And I think although some people, or many people, including even Farage himself, Nigel Farage himself, are now trying to distance themselves from Trump, we can't allow them to have that. They are in many ways, they're not identical movements, but they're clearly part of a pattern. So we got those two warnings in 2016. And I think Federal Trust has a good record already there in being an organization that was really willing to to scrutinize this result and not just simply accept the people have decided we've got to leave, but actually ask, well, what have the people decided and what does this mean? And not simply accept that the result had to be implemented, whatever that meant. So I think that's what we've done. We can't necessarily, we're not here to directly challenge Trump. We're not, that will fall to others, but we certainly have been here to challenge an important aspect of this international tendency I've been talking about, which Brexit very clearly is. And in many ways, when you look around the world, you look at the established democracies that have had populist movements within them, the act of Brexit is one of the most extreme examples of that kind of populism that I can think of. That nobody else has left the EU. Hungary hasn't left the EU. Poland didn't leave the EU. Countries that have had populist governments of various kinds have not actually gone as far as we've done and actually left the EU, and that's caused an immense amount of damage, principally to the UK, but also spillover. And it's certainly whatever the role of Vladimir Putin may have been in that referendum, and that's a very murky area. Obviously, I'm not claiming that Russian interference swung the whole thing or anything like that. It certainly was an outcome that
He was
he was
very,
very
very
happy
happy
with.
with.
There's no,
Yeah.
and continues to be happy with, and that's why we can be one of the countries that gets picked off first by this kind of Moscow Washington axis that we're seeing developing, arguably.
One,
So it's just a way of saying that's the bit we can do is challenging not just Brexit, because in a sense Brexit's happened, but also things which are outgrowths of Brexit, which are Brexit adjacent, and the kind of political ideas and movements which are connected to Brexit. And let's be clear, those movements don't just exist within Reform UK. You find them in the Conservative Party. You also find them within other mainstream parties, if you want to call the Conservatives a mainstream party, including the Labour Party, an acceptance of some of these ideas and a parroting of some of these ideas without really questioning them.
well, and that's a very good lead in to the third question, that of the environment and climate change. Because even in the Labour Party these days, there's the thought that pursuing too enthusiastic a green agenda may be something that restrains growth, which is economically damaging, at least in the short term, to the country. It's not a coincidence, is it, as they used to say in Pravda, that both many supporters of Brexit and many supporters of Donald Trump are rather sceptical about man-made climate change. Do you think that's unsurprising, or is it very much what you might expect of their underlying analysis?
Well, one word in particular, or one phrase in what you just said in particular sprang to mind. The short term, clearly, the impact of climate crisis is in anything longer than the short term. I don't think going to be very good for business, including some of the businesses that are asking us to ignore its effects and its causes. So clearly, even from a even apart from the most myopic imaginable outlook, it's not a very good idea for business. And in fact, there's lots of short-term economic benefits to be made from transition to different kinds of energy, for example. So, in that sense, it's a very very irrational policy. But if we get to the politics of it, yes, well, we have this thing we hear about all the time called the culture war that spreads across all kinds of issues and creates and is intended to create by some of those who drive it a polarization. So if you think this about, say, Brexit, you're much more likely to think this about, for example, migrants, asylum seekers, climate change, any number of issues I could mention. There's grouping of people. Not everybody fits into that pattern, but there's a broad grouping. And that becomes a real problem politically because it becomes a way of mobilizing people in support of groups of causes. And this worries politicians, particularly mainstream politicians, who might otherwise have hoped to pursue more rational, moderate programs which might be able to bring larger groups of people towards the political centre, but also mobilize them in support of doing the things we actually need to do about the climate, for example. Or you could argue the things we're going to need to do in our relationship with the EU. But it's very hard to do that if you think some of your voter base might be peeled away by this polarizing effect. In the case of the UK specifically, a particular problem I think arises from our electoral system and what politicians believe. Now, I don't know if they're right about this, but what politicians believe to be the views of crucial but fairly small numbers of what they think might be swing voters, to use a slightly quaint term, in certain constituencies. And because of the way our electoral system works, in theory, a relatively small number of voters can have a big effect. And it's impacted both this view has impacted both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Labour Party in particular, I think, will be haunted by the 2019 general election where they lost the so-called red wall, and they will believe, and they've been told this by people around them who maybe they listen to too much, that there are voters in the red wall who are going to be put off but from voting Labour, maybe will vote Conservative, maybe now will vote Reform UK if Labour takes certain stances on particular issues, such as
Such as
migration.
in,
Yeah,
or the environment as
or
well.
the environment and other issues as well, as we know. And we can
Yeah.
see this impacting upon the kind of statements and the kind of policy stances that Starmer has taken and continues to take today around these issues. And it could also be things like decisions about benefits as well. I think these are part of a group of policies where Starmer is terrified of falling on the wrong side of the cultural. And I do appreciate he's got a problem here. I'm not denying that there is a political problem here for him. I wouldn't want to be in the job doing that, but I think perhaps they are overestimating the extent to which these issues will mobilize in a way which is electorally critical and underestimating the actual damage they're doing to their ability to create a successful policy program. And also, let's not forget, in many cases, they're doing the wrong thing as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think what you're going to be starting off with is a study on the UK's relations with the European Union, or a study of where we are 10 years after the referendum. Can you just say, in conclusion, a brief word about that, how we're going to be structuring that and what we're hoping to produce when?
Yeah, so the Trust, working with partners, including the Constitution Society, is going to be commissioning what we see as audits of the impact of Brexit. In June 2026, it will be the 10th anniversary of the referendum. Neither before the referendum happening nor since the referendum has happened has any government, in my view, properly assessed what the anticipated or actual impacts of Brexit have been and are continuing to be. That hasn't happened. There hasn't been a serious official investigation of this. And given that it's the most important decision the UK has made in my lifetime. I was actually born in 1973, so I was born a member of the then European communities. I've had that stripped away from me, that citizenship stripped away from me against my will. That's another story. But the most important decision in my lifetime has certainly been the decision to leave the EU. And I would like to think that there could be some kind of assessment of how that's worked out. Now, clearly, for political reasons, the Conservative government didn't want to commission this. They'd much rather make kind of fanciful claims about the benefits. But also for political reasons, the Labour Party, who took the decision, partly with the motivations we were talking about earlier, political motivations about people who didn't want to upset, that Brexit was never going to be reversed. We were never going to rejoin the single market. We were never going to rejoin the customs union. By the way, we shouldn't talk about those things like they're actual things that are on offer anyway. But I mean, the customs union and the single market, and no return to freedom of movement. So we've got those mantras from the Labour Party. So they don't really want to commission any kind of thoroughgoing review that's actually going to tell them that some of those things, in as far as they're possible, would actually be a pretty good idea, particularly given the emphasis that they place on economic growth.
Uh,
They
um,
don't want this to
uh,
happen.
yeah, and
So it hasn't happened.
we're filling up the gap, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And we don't pretend that we can fully, fill the entirety of that gap, but we can make some initial steps towards saying what are the kind of things that are going on here? What's the evidence base? What does this evidence tell us? What's the unfolding story here? What are the different ways of interpreting it? What do we think's going on? Now, we want those investigations to be impartial. I've shown probably that I've got views on this. Different organizations have different views, but I think the starting point to any discussion about this has to be an impartial assessment of the evidence that's out there. Now, I am relatively confident that an impartial assessment of different aspects of Brexit, that includes the economic and trade effect, but also the constitutional effect, the political effect, there are different things that can be looked at, and the regulatory effect, the legal effect, all these things. I'm pretty confident that the results of such an investigation will show that Brexit has, across many different metrics, been a disaster. But I'm relaxed about that. But also think we need to start with an impartial assessment that isn't led by that conclusion at all. That looks at the evidence.
Good. Well, we'll look forward to reading the results over the coming year. Um, Thank you very much, Andrew. You've given us a fascinating overview, and the Federal Trust is in much better hands than it's been for a long time.
Oh well, I
Good
wouldn't
luck.
say that, but
Good
thank you,
luck. Good luck.
Brendan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to us.